Hey guys, so unfortunately, this is not going to be a fun one today. You've probably heard by now that there was this awful attack on a Catholic K through 8th school in Minneapolis just yesterday. The reports are that 2 children died and that several other people were injured. Now, there are two big points of interest in this story beyond the obvious tragedy and loss of life. And the first is that the reports are that the shooter was reportedly a man who identified as a woman, that it was this 23-year-old guy who had changed his name from Robert to Robin and was undergoing some sort of quote-unquote gender transition. And the second is the way that Democrats have reacted to the shooting, because it's been totally inappropriate and honestly just vile. So the Democrat rhetoric that they've all banded around has been this idea that prayers aren't enough. So you'll hear it here firsthand from Jacob Frey, who is the mayor of Minneapolis. So yeah, let's just hear him spew some nonsense.
These were Minneapolis families. These were American families. And the amount of pain that they are suffering right now is extraordinary. And don't just say this is about thoughts and prayers right now. These kids were literally praying. It was the first week of school. They were in a church.
So this is extremely bizarre on a few counts. And the first is that yes, these kids were praying because they were ostensibly Catholic and belonged to Catholic families, and Catholics believe in the power of prayer. Now, I don't think that many people are saying we solely need to be praying, we can't take any sort of political action, we can't pass any sort of legislation to address what happened here. But I think what Catholics and other Christians are saying is that prayer is powerful and real and that it accomplishes something. And what Frey seems to be suggesting is that it accomplishes nothing. And he's not alone in this. So let's look at another clip of someone supporting Frey's position here. So this is Michael Steele with Ilhan Omar on MSNBC.
Appreciate this journey. I agree with the mayor. I'm not, the thoughts and prayers, I'm so beyond that nonsense, the lie of that. Because what we have are people who continue to stand in the way of actually doing something to stop the violence against their own kids. It is amazing to me. We watch young kids die in classrooms and now in church.
This guy is really sick. I find it totally disgusting that he seems to be blaming the parents for what occurred to their children. And the suggestion here, clearly, is that if you really cared about kids, if you really cared about your child's life, then you would advocate for some sort of strict gun control laws of the sort that Democrats have been clamoring to pass for years now. He actually refers to thoughts and prayers as nonsense, which just seems incredibly dismissive when you're talking about Catholic victims, when you're talking about a gunman who seems to have chosen the school because it was Catholic and targeted them for that reason, though his manifesto and his motives are still emerging and there might be more there. But Catholics pray for the dead at every mass, and so for him to go on TV after this awful shooting occurred and basically broadcast that he thinks that everything that Catholics do is baloney, it seems like an odd choice in terms of timing. So one last example here, you have Jen Psaki of the Biden-Harris White House saying, prayer is not freaking enough. Prayer does not end school shootings. Prayers do not make parents feel safe sending their kids to school. Prayer does not bring these kids back. Enough with the thoughts and prayers. And again, I think this is a total straw man. There is nothing incompatible with praying for the dead and praying for the injured, and also saying, hey, there are steps we can take to try to ensure that this kind of thing doesn't happen. And in fact, there were people in Minneapolis who urged Tim Walz to bolster security at schools. So this comes from a report from the Daily Wire. And what they're saying is that there were these two men, Tim Benz, the president of Mind Dependent, and Jason Adkins, the executive director of the Minnesota Catholic Conference, and they sent a letter to Tim Walz in 2023 saying, hey, we need more support and we need more funding to make sure that our schools are safe. And reportedly, what they told the governor was that there is an urgent and critical need in Minnesota to make sure our schools are secure and safe in light of recent and continuing attacks on our school in this country and in our state. And they continue, they say, we need to ensure that all schools have the resources to respond to and prevent these attacks from happening to our schools. And they requested $50 million in funding for school security, which never happened. So beyond school security, as I mentioned before, the shooter reportedly identified as transgender. And if you've been paying attention, you might notice that this seems like a common thread in recent school shootings. You had the Covenant school shooting where the shooter was a female who identified as a male and who wrote about her frustrations with not being born with male anatomy. And in this case, you have a guy who's growing out his hair and reportedly telling people that he wants to go by a female name. And amazingly enough, some people, like CNN's Jake Tapper, actually want us to respect the gunman's preferred pronoun. So you have to watch this.
Another piece of the puzzle as to who the shooter was. The Minneapolis Star Tribune says, according to court records, because there's been some confusion about what the shooter's name was.
Yes.
Robin Westman's mother applied to change her child's name in 2019. It was at one point Robert Paul Westman.
Correct.
But since she identifies as a female and wants her name to reflect that identification, was underage, it's now Robin West. Another piece of the puzzle as to who the shooter was.
Okay, so if you caught that, Jake Tapper says since she identifies as a female. So it's sort of amazing to me that even after we get mountains of evidence that this guy is off his rocker, that we are still supposed to respect and affirm and acknowledge that his interpretation of his gender identity is correct. I mean, clearly he did not have a strong grip on reality, but we are supposed to, or CNN wants you to believe that in this particular instance, he really knew what he was talking about. He may have been delusional and he may have been violent, but when it comes to the question of whether or not this man is a woman, he knows what he's talking about. So you also saw Jacob Frey, again, the mayor, using this shooting as an opportunity to lecture the public about transgender rights and transgender affirmation and acceptance.
All of us. And I have heard about a whole lot of hate that's being directed at our trans community. Anybody who is using this as an opportunity to villainize our trans community or any other community out there has lost their sense of common humanity. We should not be operating out of a place of hate for anyone. We should be operating from a place of love for our kids.
Yes, so I guess that now it is a tenet of common humanity that we have to affirm clearly delusional people. This reminds me of that great Norm Macdonald tweet about Muslims and terrorism. In this case, it's like, what really terrifies me is if a trans person were to shoot up a school. Can you imagine the backlash against innocent transvestites? And obviously the ridiculous element here is that people died and people were injured and people's lives are going to be forever changed, and these are children that are going to have to deal with incredible real trauma. And this guy is such a clown that he's worried about people saying mean things online. And yeah, there are plenty of jokes to be made about a guy wearing women's dresses because that's ridiculous, but there's also a lot of people who are just bringing up the very salient point that it really looks like transgender people, or people who identify as the opposite sex, are committing a lot of violence or have been in the news in the last few years for school shootings at sort of a disproportionate level. I mean, they make up a very small percentage of the population. So for them to show up in these news stories over and over again does sort of make you wonder. Now, Amber Duke, a senior reporter here at the Daily Caller, actually looked at the Washington Post's school shooting database. And what she did was she got rid of accidental discharges, police shootings, gang violence, all of these qualitatively different events that are clouding the numbers. And she looked just at mass shootings in schools since 2023, of which there were 4. Now, 2 of these shootings were committed by people who identified as transgender. So 50% is an immense amount, and granted, it's a very small sample size, but people who identify as transgender make up maybe 1% of the population, and that's a high estimate because 1% is going to include people who maybe say, I'm non-binary, or I just, some days I feel like a man, some days I feel like a woman, and these are people who are maybe jumping on the identity because it confers social benefits, but they're not actually getting hormones or surgeries. So if you take the number of Americans that are deeply committed to attempting a gender transition, that are getting surgeries, that are getting cross-sex hormones, and you compare that extremely small percentage to 50% of school shootings in the last 2 years being committed by trans-identified people, it's pretty incredible. There's clearly a problem going on here. And it's not that surprising because obviously hormones have very powerful effects on people's personalities and emotions and inclinations. And so pumping yourself full of estrogen or testosterone might have some unintended consequences. Now, there are other threads we could also try to pull to identify some commonalities in school shooters over the past 2 decades. So there's been a lot of speculation about SSRIs, which I think is fair. A lot of those SSRIs really numb people's emotions, and many of them warn you on the box that, you know, hey, this might increase suicidal thoughts, it could create violent thoughts, mood swings. Another factor might be some manifestation of autism, given that autistic men seem to be more likely to believe that they're transgender, and you could understand why. I mean, if you have a hard time understanding other people's emotions and what's going on in their minds, it might be easier to convince yourself that, well, hey, maybe I really do think like a woman, or maybe the reason why I don't fit in and I feel awkward and I feel uncomfortable in my body is because I'm really this other thing. And so there are all these factors that we can look at. Plenty of people who are praying for the victims are also looking at these factors and saying, hey, guns are not the independent factor in creating school shootings, in violence. The guns are not acting independently. Certain people choose to turn those weapons on kids and on innocent people, and the question is why? Why are these people doing it? And how can we stop that? And I think that's the question that needs to be asked and solved. Not, you know, how do we take away guns from the millions of Americans that are using them for hunting or for protection or for other licit and good purposes. So those are my thoughts on the awful reaction from Democrats to this news. But let me know what you think in the comments section below. Give this video a like, hit subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.